PSVR2 is here, and so far, opinions are divided. On one hand, people love the new innovations, an amazing job that Sony has done with the eye tracking, the design, and overall immersion. But on the other hand, some people are criticising the wired nature of the device, the lack of launch content, and the inability to use it as a PC VR headset. Whether you agree with those statements or not, there's one thing that nearly everybody is saying about the PSVR2. If you want the best value VR experience, then this is it. To warn you in advance though, I do share some of the common reservations about the longevity of this device, which I'll talk about later on in the episode, but for now, let's take a look at the specs. The large 560-gram headset is quite the imposing looking device. For good reason though, because it packs some impressive specs. The display is OLED, which gives fantastic contrast and HDR visuals at a resolution of 2000 by 2040 per eye, and at a maximum refresh rate of 120 Hz. The display lenses are width adjustable, as is the distance of the lenses from the eye, and gives a field of view of around 110 degrees. There's an internal infrared camera for eye tracking, 6-axis motion sensing, 4 external cameras, and even a built-in mic to record your voice. It lacks onboard speakers, but it does have a stereo headphone jack at the back, and included in the box are neat in-ear headphones that clip on the rear. It's powered by the PS5 through USB-C, and the controllers are charged by USB-C also. These feature much the same features as the Sony DualSense controller, and will last around 5 hours on a complete charge. On paper, this headset has some really comprehensive specs, and it all comes together to create worlds like this. Oh wow! Jesus. Oh, that looks fantastic. Oh my lord. What you're watching is my first experience of Kayak VR, and what can I say, the visuals are utterly astounding, and although you don't get the full effect of the HDR that I'm seeing through the lenses, I think you'd agree that it looks beautiful. The way this plant behaves. What the size of that fish? Jesus! There's a dolphin! The most impressive thing about this is that the total cost of both the PlayStation that runs it and the headset that puts me in this unbelievably detailed and vibrant landscape comes to a total of just £970. Now, to some of you that might seem like a lot of money, but comparatively, it's peanuts. Let's take a look at some of the other leading VR headsets with comparable specs. Most of them cost more, and then add a high-spec PC on to play good enough VR with a similar level as the PS5, and you're looking at 1,500 of the King's pounds at a bare minimum. Now, you could say, well, what about the Oculus/Meta Quest? Well, you wouldn't be wrong, that is cheaper at $399, but that's like comparing a Porsche with a Ford Fiesta in terms of its graphical capabilities and immersion. Now, believe me when I say that Sony have done a fantastic job of making the PSVR2 an excellent immersive experience. And I think one of the most game-changing elements of this immersion isn't even in the headset. It's in the controllers What makes them so good is that the same adaptive trigger and haptic technology from the PS5 DualSense controller is included in these new VR controllers, along with the new touch sensing capabilities for added hand tracking functions. I slandered the adaptive trigger technology and haptics in my original review of the PS5, saying that they were good, don't get me wrong, but will likely end up a gimmick that most developers will fail to properly integrate into games, and I wasn't wrong. The experience has been flaky at best. But I'm going to put my tinfoil hat speculation on here, because seeing these on the PSVR2, I couldn't help but think that Sony was using the DualSense controller as a crowdsourced beta test for the adaptive triggers, simply to test their inclusion for the VR controllers. Speculation, of course. But boy, do these adaptive triggers make a big difference to the overall immersion. Wrong hand. Better. The fact that games like Pavlov, I'm getting a full trigger feedback, like I'm actually pulling the trigger of a gun, is just insane. And the detailed haptic vibration feedback is also incredible. Sure, you aren't going to get anywhere near the feel of a gun kick, but it's still a really textured vibration system that feels incredible. Ooh, it's got some kick. As for the immersion of the headset itself, what's interesting is that they've also included a subtle vibration motor built into the back of the actual headset to give you feedback as well. Now, I thought that this was going to be a bit mad, like using one of those massage guns on the side of your head or something. But it's actually very subtle, so it's not designed to make you feel like you've been shot in the face. It's more of a small addition to add a little bit of overall immersive feel. But vibrations to one side, with the specs of the headset, it really provides a decent experience. It's got a really good refresh rate, which means the image is smooth. It's got high resolution, which means it's sharp. And with an FOV of 110 degrees, it's quite respectable. It's not the widest view, and you can visually see outside of the lenses when you're using it, although this is very, very minimal, and you quickly become sucked into the world that you're playing in. I will commend Sony here for the design, because the immersion is often broken by poor fit, light leaks, and being uncomfortable. But I actually found it super comfortable. It's light, and there's tons of adjustment that you can do to make it fit your head, no matter how bulbous it is. But perhaps the best bit of the design for the overall feel is that they've done a fantastic job of blocking all of the light out. I don't notice any light leak at all with the rubber eye surrounds and nose flaps, which do sort of remind me a bit of an accordion. Sony opted not to include a built-in speaker, which is probably a sensible save on weight, but they did include small headphones that click into the rear of the headset. Now, I didn't think I would like these quite as much as I do. They are really comfortable, and I don't really see any need to go for anything else, unless maybe you don't like in-ear style headphones. The soundscape of the headphones as well was actually really detailed, and they do really, really well with the head tracking and full 3D audio and immersion of the whole experience. But it's all very well and good having a super immersive experience in terms of the hardware and specs, but for me, the immersion is always hinged on the graphics, and because the PSVR2 runs exclusively from the PS5, the graphical capabilities are somewhat limited. Or are they? Well, I can happily say that I've been in a state of disbelief with how good the graphics are, considering this is a VR experience from a setup that costs less than $1,000. And the way Sony have achieved this remarkable feat is not through voodoo witchcraft, but through an unbelievably clever way to maximize the available processing power of the PS5 with something you would never expect: the eye tracking. Now, this is perhaps the most magical piece of the hardware puzzle for this device on paper. Although it might not seem that important, in truth, it's the difference between holding its weight in the ring and being knocked out in the first round. It uses something called, and I'll be damned if I'll be able to pronounce this correctly for the first time, Foveated rendering. That's probably wrong, isn't it? Anyway, this utilizes eye tracking to render the world that you're in at a higher resolution in just the area that you're focused in at the center of your vision, which means that the PS5 can focus its processing power much more efficiently. The thing is, it's so good that you'll never even realize it's doing it, and it'll probably seem like a myth. If you try and look for it, you'll never be able to get a glimpse of it, because it's that good. It's like staring at the sky and trying to get a good look at those squiggly lines in your vision that you can't normally see. When you move your eye to look at them, they move out of the way. If you could get a good look of foveated rendering, it might look something like this, with the sharper, high detail in the center of your vision and lower resolution around the outside of your vision. Now, when your eyes move, it moves the higher resolution section to follow you to look with the environment. This is a brilliant inclusion for the PSVR2, and although it's not a new innovation, it's certainly the first time we're seeing this in a consumer device at this price point, and it absolutely works wonders. And overall, this is undeniably an incredible piece of hardware for the price it's at. But one of the biggest challenges of the PSVR 2 is going to be its longevity. Looking at the original PSVR for an example, it's mostly a forgotten piece of tech which is likely sitting on the bottom of your shelf covered in dust next to your Xbox Kinect camera, or your fondue set, or your George Foreman grill. It really didn't see much support from developers over its lifetime, which is mostly down to the limits of the PS4, but also because of the closed ecosystem that Sony made for it. Unfortunately, they've done the same here. The PSVR 2 is also a closed ecosystem with very few meaningful games at launch. At least this time, the actual tech is comparative to the standardized VR experience, which potentially makes it easier for developers to port the games to. But still, this is very dependent on developers specifically developing for the PS5. And going by past example, I don't have great faith in this, which is solidified by the lack of titles that have been updated from PSVR 1 to PSVR 2 compatibility. Now, I get it, the hardware is massively different, but I had thought that Sony might have at least put a bit of money into this and incentivized developers to update more PSVR 1 titles to work with the 2. Of course, some have already updated, but at a cost. The only thing that could have eased my concern about this lack of support is if this headset had supported not only its own internal ecosystem, but also worked as a PC VR headset. But Sony have done us a dirty here by not making it so. And that's a crying shame, because this tech is incredible. Having PC VR support would have guaranteed the longevity and support for this device long after Sony has moved on from it. But unfortunately, it doesn't have this, and that certainly knocks it down a peg or two in terms of its value for me. Now, I'm not the only one to have this opinion, but it seemingly has come under quite a bit of criticism, including even from my most bestest friend, Dan. He said being annoyed that it doesn't support PC VR is like being annoyed that my car doesn't make toast, given that my car was never advertised to do so in the first place. Which is fair, but then my counter-argument was that if every other manufacturer made a car with a toaster, wouldn't it be rather ridiculous to make a car without one? Because that's what nearly every other headset is capable of, its own ecosystem, and working with PC VR. It just doesn't really make much sense. Toyota toast. Toast. Putting the toast to one side, I thought that by creating this closed ecosystem that Sony would have developed a way to play wirelessly with the PSVR 2. But of course they didn't. Now, this isn't going to be so much a big deal to most people if all you've known is wired VR. It'll be no different because it's a single wire and relatively unobtrusive, and a hell of a lot better than the train wreck of the first gen's mess of Medusa cables. But having used the Quest 2 for VR over the past year or so, I've become accustomed to playing wire-free. Coming back to wired use, it just feels like a huge step back having to be tethered to the PS5. Thing is, wireless VR with the headset to PC already exists with the Quest, and it's pretty stable too. Even if Sony had just built in the option of playing wirelessly rather than the sole method, then I would have been happy. The step back actually goes further though, as the cable that you plug into the PS5 is actually built into the headset itself, meaning if you're a frantic kayaker and end up wrenching the cable out, it could cause irreparable damage to the headset, again causing me more concern over its longevity. It's such early days for the PSVR2, and much of my misgivings are largely based on still feeling a little bit burnt about the poor experience of the first gen. I hope that these are proved wrong, however, because it's undeniably an amazing piece of VR tech and at an incredible price point. Maybe if you're new to VR and don't have a PS5, at just under £1,000 it is quite a big ask, especially if you're one of those people who just might be interested in dabbling in VR to see if it's something for you. But if you already have a PS5 and want an experience of VR, I can wholeheartedly say that this is the best graphical and immersive experience that you can buy for your money right now. It just might not be the most comprehensive one long term. What do you think? Do you think the PSVR2 is a great VR headset? Do you agree or disagree with my thoughts on it? Let me know in the comments below, and make sure you hit that thumbs up and subscribe button if you're new to the channel. And I'll see you back for another episode of Stu's Reviews soon. Still look like a tit when you take VR off. Sweaty tit.